Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming and joining us. It's 4:30. We're approaching happy hour time. Maybe it's already happy hour time for some of you who are based on the East Coast. So glad you're here for this conversation. My name is SARA KERR, and for those of you who I don't know, I see some familiar faces in the room. But for those of you who I don't know, I work for an organization, a nonprofit called Results for America, where I lead our education work. And Results for America as an organization is focused on, at a very high level, making evidence-based policy making the quote-unquote new normal, which I feel like I'm in a room of friends, right? That's an agenda that I think hopefully everyone in this room also believes in. And we work at all levels of government and across policy sectors, but like I said, I've had the privilege of leading our education work for the past couple of years. And prior to that, worked at a state education agency. I was the chief performance officer at the Delaware Department of Education, and also had the chance to work alongside lots of state education agencies and local education agencies, school districts, through other nonprofit organization work that I've done. But my heart is really in the SEA space, so it's a real privilege to continue to have opportunities to work with lots of smart state education folks, as well as folks in school districts and other organizations, including researchers and policymakers who are all seeking to support the work we're doing in the public education sector. So if you are here for the policy talk titled The Intersection, I have to read it to make sure I get it right, The Intersection of Evidence, Equity, and Continuous Improvement in ESSA, Examples and Opportunities, then you are in fact in the right place. And if you are not in fact here for that talk, there is no this is a judgment-free zone, so you can feel free to get up and leave and go to the talk that you intended to, but we hope you'll stay. We're excited to have this conversation, thrilled to see that there's an interest in really sort of earnestly talking about these intersections and really thinking. We're hoping to get your best thinking about how we can be more intentional about connecting the dots and really building and using evidence to surface and address really persistent and often pervasive opportunity gaps for our historically underserved students. So thank you to you all for being a part of this conversation, and to my panelists for agreeing to be here. In just a few moments, I'll ask them to introduce themselves, both those who are joining us in person and our virtual participant, who we're really glad to have here. We're fingers crossed, hoping that technology cooperates, and we ask that you just bear with us if it fails, which it probably will at some point, but we're hoping for the best. So before we jump in and I have the panelists introduce themselves and we do a little sort of scan of the audience to get a sense of who's in the room with us today, I wanted to just offer a couple of framing remarks and thoughts about both the genesis of the policy talk, just like where the idea came from to have this conversation here, as well as sort of what we hope we all collectively get out of the conversation today. So actually, Kendra, I think you were in the room and SENG for this conversation about a year ago. We sat around a table with former US Secretary of Education and current president of the Education Trust, John King, whom I'm guessing many in this room know, or at least have heard of, and hopefully at least a few of you have had the chance to listen to. He's brilliant, I think one of the brilliant thinkers in particular about these issues of equity, and I think arguably has given the most thought to the intersections of equity and evidence, in the field at this point. So we had this great opportunity to have, kind of an around-the-table conversation with him. About a year ago, RFA supports a fellowship of about 24 state education leaders. Like I said, Kendra from Massachusetts is in the audience, is a part of it, as well as Thing from Nevada. And we sat around the table and really just listened to him sort of talk about this issue and potential intersections of evidence and equity. And as he always does, he offered many, many pearls of wisdom. And I think at the time, without even really realizing it, outlined what I think was one of the most policy relevant research agendas that I've ever come across. And I literally think he just got up that day and was like, here's what's top of mind for me. But he just articulated these sort of 7 policy areas. And I think he said, this was the quote I had jotted down, like, policy areas for which we, quote, know some stuff, but not nearly enough. Like, I think those were his words. And really, like, pushed us and said, like, if we, the collective we, researchers, policymakers, practitioners, could really kind of hone in and focus and dig in these 7 areas, we could really begin to meaningfully move the needle on more equitable opportunities and outcomes for kids. So we had the privilege of listening to him sort of articulate these 7 points or policy areas, which spanned the education spectrum, you know, starting from early childhood education to career readiness to job training, you know, touching on topics that are top of mind for all of us, like the mismatch between student and teacher demographics, right? So despite what we know about what the research says about how important even just you know, having one teacher of color is for Black and brown students, the reality is that that's so often not the case, right? We talked about sort of the reality of students of color and those living in poverty continuing to remain significantly less likely than their peers in many parts of the country to attend schools with access to rigorous courses like chemistry and Algebra 2 and advanced placement. So we sort of laid out, you know, all of these 7 policy areas, detailed places where, you know, we can really dig in and both better use the existing research we have, but also really dig in and build new evidence and think about new ways of building that evidence and thinking about sort of research in the impacted communities versus in the typical communities in which research is conducted. So we just really laid out lots of great ideas, and I think it really spurred thinking amongst many of us in the room. And at the end of that talk, we started to have this great conversation that explored these opportunities for policymakers and researchers to really work together in tandem to pursue these equity-focused research agendas. In particular, given what I often refer to as like this ESSA moment, where, you know, there's arguably more emphasis than there has been historically on the use of evidence and continuous improvement. Many mentions and provisions in the law often feel like they're sort of scattershot in there, but there was in fact some attention there, I think, by Congress. And this renewed focus on equity, and I think as we all know, ESSA at its core is a civil rights law. So we had this great conversation, but we really ran out of time at the end to delve into sort of the particulars of these intersections, and we thought that AEFP would be a perfect place to sort of pick up where we left off and continue the conversation. And so that's what we hope to do here today. So in the next 80 or so minutes, our goal is, together with all of you and with our panelists, to really highlight opportunities and examples of both SEAs and LEAs, leveraging the equity, evidence, and continuous improvement spirit or orientation of ESSA. So we'll have a chance to hear both from folks who work inside state education agencies as well as folks who work adjacent and very closely with SEAs and LEAs about their experiences, and hopefully get some real concrete examples and ways and new ideas for policy, how policymakers at all levels of government can really embed and more deeply and intentionally embed equity, evidence, and continuous improvement in research, policy, and practice agendas. And in particular, I think I'm really interested in hearing from those of you on the research side, sort of how researchers can support and even steer policymakers towards pursuing these equity-minded agendas. So that's where we're headed. We have built in several opportunities for some audience participation. 90 minutes is a long time, although I think it'll go quickly, but we really do want to engage all of you in the conversation. And so the way we've structured this is to have opportunities not just at the end for you to engage and ask questions and offer your thoughts, but throughout the conversation we're going to intentionally pause and ask you some questions and hopefully do some kind of popcorn sharing out with the group. So I think, without further ado, I'm going to ask our illustrious panelists to introduce themselves. I think we'll start with SENG and then LENAY, and then we'll hear from KHALILAH, true test for our technology, and then we'll do a little poll of the audience and dive in.
Thank you, Sarah. So my name is SENG-DAO Yang Kyo. I am from the Nevada Department of Education, and I lead as the director the Office of Student and School Supports. And this particular office manages most of the federal programs as well as most of our large state programs. So everything from Title I, Title III, Title IV, as well as our state categorical programs, which include Read by Grade 3, which is, you know, implied in that name, Victory. This would be for low-income students. We've got a Zoom program focused on English learners, and then SB 178, which is basically the bottom quartile performing students that are either low income or EL students. So big picture, and there are, you know, some other smaller state and federal programs there too. So big picture, it's the school improvement program side of the Nevada Department of Education, and the way that I would describe our team is that we are the largest team within the Nevada Department of Education, but because it's very small, our SEA has about 170 people. So this is a team, for example, one of my teammates, Gabby Pinay, Lamar, sorry, she just got married, is joining me here today. But our team has multiple hats, right? So every person, individual people will lead huge programs and will also work on several of the projects at the same time. And so that's big picture, the work that we do.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm LENAY DUNN. I'm from WestEd, and WestEd is a national not-for-profit research and service agency. And I work on several key projects there. I'm the assistant director of the Center on School Turnaround, which is a national content center, federally funded. And I'm also a partnership lead for the Regional Educational Laboratory West, which is I'm sure most of you know about the federal lab programs that have been around for about 50 years. So I work with Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah through the labs. And a lot of my work is at the intersection of school improvement and evidence. And I work closely with state education agencies in our region and then also nationally, helping them think through their approach to evidence-based improvement strategies. And I also provide hands-on training and workshops with districts to help them sort of navigate that along with their state agency partners.
Thank you. All right, true test of the technology, KHALILAH. Go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Okay. All right, I'm KHALILAH Harris. I am the Managing Director for K-12 Policy at the Center for American Progress based out of Washington, D.C. We're a global think tank and we work on every and any justice issue you can imagine. Previously, I was Deputy Director for the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans in the Obama administration. I'm currently also a lecturer at Towson University, and I focus my work on culturally relevant pedagogy. At CAP, as Managing Director, I am leading efforts to ensure that we are explicitly taking a race and income equity lens to both policies that we've either recommended in the past or will put forward, but also taking a look at how evidence can support our ability to, and everyone's ability to create policies that take a race equity lens instead of, making an assumption that because it's for students from communities with lower income or young people who are born into communities that might indicate they may struggle, that instead we are taking an explicit race equity lens and income equity lens, so we're not recommending policies that never levels the playing field, but instead positions communities that were already behind and already suffering from systemic inequity, continuing to do so because strategies aren't being recommended to mitigate for issues based on race, particularly when we know that all Black and brown children are not from communities of lower income. And oftentimes we see in these policies that those two things are conflated, and so we never end up establishing policy, but at a minimum inspecting for how inequity is baked into policies we're recommending in the education reform space.
Great. Thank you, KHALILAH. And good news, we can hear you nice and loud and clear, so hopefully that'll continue to be the case. Good, so I just want to get a quick sense of who's in the room and then we'll dive into the meat of the conversation. So just trying to get a sense, if you are like a university-based researcher, raise your hand, okay? Other researchers who work in outside of universities and research organizations, these are great. Couple hands over there. Do we have any folks from inside government, so either the federal level, state, local? Okay, great, good number of you in the room. Any school leaders or educators currently in schools?
Oh. School district?
School district, yeah, or LEA, yeah. And did we get a hand for current educator? Great, welcome. Nonprofit, folks who are in the nonprofit or kind of at adjacent space. Great, anyone I missed? Who I didn't cover? Students. Yay. Woohoo. Okay, great.
That's amazing.
Welcome, good. So nice mix of folks. I always just like to get a sense, especially I think helpful for panelists to get a sense of who's in the room and where your interest lies, so thanks for that. Location-wise, if you are from the West, you consider yourself live in the West part of the country, raise your hand. Okay? East Coasters? I'm bi-coastal at this point. You did not come here to hear my life story. From the South.
Oh, wait, Southeast?
Southeast? Yeah, I didn't do like it's good. Like these are not discrete categories. This is a problematic, yeah. Lots of researchers in the room can poke holes at this, whatever. Midwest. Okay, woohoo, okay. Anyone else who didn't raise their hand, didn't fall into any of those buckets? Okay, hopefully I got this. Okay, the last one. The decade in which you started your education career. 1960s.
Like research.
Okay. 1970s. 1980s. 1990s. Raise your hand. 2000s. 2010s. All right. Great. Well, thank you for indulging us in that. It's always really helpful, like I said, just to get a sense of who's in the room. All right, we are going to dive in, and my first question is about sort of to help us set the context. So I'm going to ask LENAY to start us off. Describe the equity and civil rights orientation of ESSA. So how is ESSA different in that respect from its predecessor, from No Child Left Behind?
Sure. So I think No Child Left Behind gave us the first real impetus or focus on subgroups. We just really didn't focus on subgroups before No Child Left Behind. What ESSA has done is taken it another step further and said there is a commitment and a responsibility that states and districts have to not just recognize those gaps and look at subgroups and know that those gaps are happening, but to look for those opportunity and achievement gaps and then find systemic ways to address those. So there are certain things in ESSA, looking at distribution of teachers, looking at access that students have to certain opportunities that really have shifted the conversation, I think, to really be more beyond just we're going to report out this data to thinking about how do we specifically address it and requirements for that. And I'll also say I think there's more of a shared accountability lens in ESSA than there was in No Child Left Behind. There's sort of this, the state and the districts and the schools are responsible and accountable for what's happening and these gaps that are happening, and that I think was a little bit of a shift.
Saying anything that you'd add from your perspective, context-wise, sitting in an SEA right now?
Absolutely. I think, so I'm going to build on that because I think big picture, our team, for example, is responsible for providing support for CSI schools, comprehensive support and improvement schools, as well as thinking about how we can support districts as they support TSI schools, targeted support and improvement schools. And again, I mean, when we start looking at the difference between the types of support, you really have to differentiate as a state education leader, the supports that you're going to provide the bottom 5% lowest performing schools versus schools where there are subgroup inequities, right, and opportunity gaps. And I think having those rigorous conversations, I mean, I think that is one clear difference because what typically folks, historically at least within the agency, are used to hearing is, let's just look at the bottom, like the lowest performing schools. And I'm like, but what do you mean by that, right? Like how are we differentiating between CSI and TSI supports across the state? And then the other thing that I would say is, the way that I generalize NCLB, like when I think about NCLB, like it really was about, for example, right, highly effective teachers. And ESSA shifts that to, what are your outcomes? And that's a very different conversation when you start having it with education leaders, right? Because one is, okay, show me your resume, show me what you've done to get here. Okay, we're gonna trust that you actually make an impact on student outcomes. But now it's like, we are narrowly and singularly focused on what are your outcomes? Because at the end of the day, like even if you think you're great and we think you're great too, like we actually want some evidence to demonstrate that we're spending our money on things that work, quite frankly. And so I think those are the biggest things. The only other thing I would add to is, and this might just be our state agency, but I don't think it is. Let's have honest conversations with each other around how much state education leaders actually even look at federal law and know it. And the reason why I'm saying that is, my colleague Gabby and I were just talking about it. If we polled our state agency, again, 170 people, and asked them to answer this question, I can tell you right now, maybe 5 to 10 people, and that would probably be like all of cabinet, that could answer it. Maybe another 10 people could after that, like maybe would be closer on the spot. But there is a gap in understanding, and part of this is because there isn't an intentional focus on differentiating between leadership changes as well as policy changes, and so I just want to put that out there.
Great. So I heard a couple of answers that sort of you would have perhaps come under this next question, but you might build off of it. So I mean, yeah, I would say hang on, thanks. I'm going to follow up with you. I'd like to dig a little bit deeper and just think about sort of this question about how states and districts, right, because you work with all of the districts in Nevada and have a sort of a national lens as well, how can you really sort of use the policy, in particular sort of the new policies or new opportunities under ESSA as a real lever to address achievement and opportunity gaps? So we've heard a little bit about the context and some of the changes in the law. What are the real opportunities for states in particular and also districts to use these as a lever to more intentionally and meaningfully address the achievement gaps?
So I'm going to give a shout out actually to Results for America, because through the fellowship, I will say that the learning opportunities, learning with other states, including Massachusetts, right? My colleagues from Massachusetts who are in the room, has been an incredible learning opportunity that has opened, I believe, our eyes to the missed opportunities historically in the state of Nevada. So very quickly, what I will say is we saw an opportunity for us to redefine state agencies' leadership and our authority. And this is something historically that we had never done before. So for example, we completely redesigned our competitive grant application process within the Office of Student and School Supports. And then we consolidated it so that it was multiple grants. It was federal grants and state grants. And we heard from the federal government, heard from Results for America, heard from other organizations like WestEd and CCSSO that, hey, here's an opportunity for state agencies to really lead and also to be, and we heard from the feds, right, saying, you guys are actually our big bets in this work. And so we took that as an opportunity to say, here's an opportunity for the state of Nevada now to change how we have practiced, to change our own behaviors as adults. So we redesigned all of our competitive grants to then prioritize evidence-based interventions. And specifically, we led with Title I, 1003A school improvement dollars. For the state of Nevada, that's close to 9 million, so we distribute about 8.5 million across the state every year. And we were pretty narrow and strict in that regard. We said everything that the districts asked for. So we went 100% competitive grants, which was a huge shift because it used to be formula funded. And then what used to happen is the districts typically would just ask for whatever they wanted to ask for. And historically, NDE would say, okay, fine, we're gonna fund it. So we went 100% competitive, which scared districts, by the way, right? Because then there were our two largest districts. Washoe that's the Reno area, and then Clark County School District, that's Las Vegas, 5th largest district in the nation. And we said, hi, you need to ask for things that meet ESSA evidence levels 1, 2, or 3. And so I'm gonna make some assumptions that you guys know what that is. But very quickly, ESSA evidence level 1 would be RCT studies. 2 would be quasi-experimental studies. 3 would be correlational studies, right? Statistically significant, shows a positive impact on student outcomes. And so we did that, and it scared them, right? And this was a moment where they were like, you don't have the authority or the right to do this. We're like, you're serious? And so it was a game of chicken. I kid you not, it was a game of chicken for several months where they're like, you're not gonna do this. We're gonna ask for whatever we've always asked for, and you're gonna fund it because we're gonna get all the districts, all 17 districts. Everybody who's gonna apply, we're gonna apply for the same things, and you're just kidding. And I was like, no, actually, this is now kind of, this is a moment where, yeah, we're playing chicken because there is going to be that one rural district, and there was, and I said to them, this rural district is going to ask for everything that meets ESSA evidence levels 1, 2, or 3. And now they used to win $40,000, but now they're going to win $2.5 million. How about that? And that's when they're like, oh, you're serious? Oh, yeah, we were serious. So we redesigned that process, and we are now 2 years into it. So we transitioned what we estimate was 15% of our dollars being spent on things at work, meeting ESSA evidence levels 1, 2, and 3, to now 100% of our funds for the past 2 years meet ESSA evidence levels 1, 2, or 3. And the outcomes show. I think, well, the short-term outcomes, right? The districts that trusted the process, they were nervous and they were scared, have come back to us and said, we fought you, we really actually hated you guys, and we really fought you 2 years ago. And now, we have had the most transformational change that we've ever experienced at our central office level. We are now looking at data deeply. We are having honest, difficult conversations, courageous conversations around equity and the students that we need to serve that have been really underserved and marginalized. And so I think in that way, like shifting dollars is one way of a state leveraging its authority. The other thing is we have started doing this, but the districts still have not, they didn't bite yet. But we have prioritized rigorous evaluations, and that is an opportunity for us to really ask ourselves, how do we continuously improve? So it is not a gotcha, and we're not just looking for long-term, kind of like really expensive evaluations. Like we are interested in all types of evaluations, high-quality ones, right? Like so rapid cycles of evaluation, as well as like long-term, longitudinal, rigorous evaluations. And so we prioritize that in our competitive grants, where we said, if you want to figure out how you're going to get better, we will invest in that. And we're still hoping that districts buy into this. They're really nervous and scared about it. And part of that is because I think there might be some fear of it's a gotcha. But again, we've tried to frame this in a way of we need to figure out what's working in the local context and why it's working, and then shine a light on the pockets of excellence so that we can spread these excellent practices across the state of Nevada. And so big picture, I think those were the ways in which we saw opportunities to, again, build local capacity, build a local research base, which we lack, quite frankly, right? Like a lot of researchers are not very interested in coming to Nevada until, I would say, a little bit more recently. We've had some excitement in the state. But it's really important for us to think about what that means to build the local research base, to build the local evidence base, to support local organizations that don't have a lot of money, but want to do great work and are committed to partnering up with schools and district leaders to make sure that we're providing students with an excellent and equitable education.
Perfect. Two really concrete examples. The shift in competitive grant processes itself to really privilege and prioritize, and in this case require, evidence-based practices.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
So you're saying, one of the things that we're discovering is that it's less, oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yep. Jump.
Sorry.
Come on, actually, if you come right up here, you can. Yeah.
Great. I didn't know.
Tell us who you are.
Hi,
You can't say no to Kendra.
I'm the research
And we'll go back to
evalu-
regularly scheduled
Yeah.
programming.
I'm the research and evaluation coordinator from Massachusetts, and one of the things that we're finding with regard to supporting and investing in local evaluations is that folks are not worried about the state at all. They're worried about the local politics. So principals feel very vulnerable. If they've selected something, they're going to invest in evaluation. What happens when it doesn't work? So is their superintendent going to have their head? And then superintendents are also equally concerned about the political ramifications, because the reality is much of local education is political, and as is true of the state, but we're not the problem. They're not worried about us. They're much more worried about their colleagues, or whether or not an evaluation can demonstrate that something is effective, and if it's not effective, do they then have egg all over their face? So I'm just wondering how you manage that.
That's a great question. I think we are about to enter that space right now. So there is a local school within one of our larger districts, and we are about to negotiate a rigorous evaluation for them. Now the school wants it. The district had a great opportunity to embark on this too, and never, like we were gonna honestly redirect a lot of money to this particular district for rigorous evaluation. And I think one of the things that we're hoping to do is using this as a success story, quite frankly. And the reason why I'm saying that is because this is a school where they are focused on, and actually, let me give you the context of the school. It's about 150 students.
I was going to say briefly, so you can
Yeah, 150 students. And the long story short is, these are students that self-identify as, hey, the district threw us away. And they say that publicly. They're like, hey, we're the kids that the district doesn't care about. And so this is a ripe, opportune moment for us to basically say, listen, you've kind of got nothing to lose because the district wasn't really investing dollars in this school anyway, but you guys have something pretty magical going on, and we want to figure out, is it actually really working and making an impact on students? And so we're hoping to use the words I'm thinking that I've heard within some of these organizations, especially at RFA, is we're hoping to build a champion for this at the school leader and at the district level, so that they are the champions for this across the state to get us more buy-in.
Lenay, did you want to jump in and remark on that, or a different, something to jump into? But
Well, I was going to say, I think even if it shows it's not successful, it's still a win. And I think we were talking about the policy levers that the state has. The state has funding and it has accountability. I think districts have data use and professional learning. And if you can combine those and think about it's a learning opportunity to look at data, use data, and reframe that. And I think the state agency has a role in that there's that transparency of data and the culture that's being used around that professional learning. But I think if the districts can see it as that opportunity and it's a safe space for that learning, hopefully that'll continue. But I think we need to see more examples like that. It's still early in that. We haven't gotten a lot of those examples yet. It's a good question.
yeah. Good. Thanks, Kendra, for the question. And I think we're continuing to think about, there's sort of this cultural aspect of what it means to, we talk a lot about sort of making it safe to fail. We talk about it in the context of kids often, but I think the same is true for education agencies at all levels, and what does it really mean? I think that there's a lot of tension because we've been living in a very high stakes accountability world that often is at odds with the idea of being a learning organization. And I think we will be better off in education personally if we can pivot and become more oriented around learning, even if it means that we are doing things that sometimes don't have the intended impact or the impact that we would have hoped, and that we're taking that and feeding it back into a cycle of continuous improvement and using it to change and improve over time rather than use data as a hammer, as our friends at Data Quality Campaign say, in this sort of high stakes accountability way. So I think that's I think that's a big shift and one that has started to happen, but it's not an up and down sort of we can just flip the light switch and change things. So KHALILAH, I want to give you a chance to jump into the conversation. You're welcome to sort of add any comments to thoughts that others have shared. And I'd also love for you to sort of give us an example of either in your current position at CAP, which is I know relatively new, or in previous work that you've done. How has evidence informed? Give us a concrete example of how evidence has informed a policy decision that you've made or that you've been a part of, and the extent to which equity was simultaneously sort of considered in that decision, if you can.
Sure. So if I can add to the previous discussion, something that presents a challenge when you're talking about equity and continuous learning is the crucial conversation around what achievement looks like for which populations of children. And by that, I mean for affluent kids and for young people in particular communities, evidence of achievement and learning may look like their participation in a national robotics competition, spelling bee, their arts performances, things that are holistic and about the whole child. And then in other communities that have been historically underserved or not performing based on standardized tests, they are determined to be, students there are determined to not be learning and not achieving. And so sometimes solutions and the theory of action is related to getting them to achieve on different metrics than those we would apply to students who either don't look like them or have the types of resources that provide a hidden curriculum for those students to achieve at levels that are that contribute to society and support those children in living their best lives beyond school. So I just wanted to add that oftentimes we're looking at data, the approach to looking at data in and of itself can sometimes present bias in terms of what we expect from different populations of students, if that makes sense. So I wanted to lift that up. But in terms of policies that I worked on, the biggest one that I can think of is while I was at the White House Initiative, working with both Arne Duncan and then subsequently John King on school discipline guidance. And that policy explicitly was looking at inequity based on different things like access to curriculum, access to rigorous curriculum, the disparities between students based on gender, ability, and of course race. And we know right now that the school discipline guidance has been constantly under attack, but that policy was certainly considered, I think, also in the writing of ESSA. We see in ESSA that we have the educator equity requirements for states to communicate how they're creating more equitable opportunities for different people to enter the teaching workforce and be retained in the teaching workforce, as well as how they're trained. But the school discipline guidance was a major policy development that I was involved in that was explicitly about equity. And explicitly about equity from a vantage point, again, of what do we expect the learning environment to look like for all of our students.
Thanks, KHALILAH. So
yeah,
we're going to pause here and give you all a chance to sort of weigh in and do some individual thinking and then talking to each other. So the question I have for you all, and hopefully you all have kind of an elbow partner, one or two people sitting near you, is what shifts, if any, have you seen in your work? And we now know that there are a variety of different roles and types of work that you all are engaged in. What shifts have you seen in how evidence is being used to inform policy, particularly policy that seeks to promote more equitable opportunities and outcomes for students? So what shifts have you seen or observed in your work? So we're just going to take 2 or 3 minutes for you to just turn to a partner, turn to someone near you, share some ideas, and then we'll do some popcorn sharing after that. So just take a couple minutes and have a chat about that.
I was going to give you more. So somebody from our sorry, I didn't so anyway, so
That's great. Very good.
Together equity evidence-based, but what evidence? How are they going to require
Are there
Of course, not what we're
One more minute. I will give you 2 hands. I'll give all eyes.
Anyway, so why not? And maybe they vary some influences, but that makes sense. Or didn't get what we're going to
I don't know. I spent a lot of that. So I and I was, yeah, well, because I'm going to go get like in but yeah, I think I think anyway, but it's just hard to figure for that. Right. No, I agree. It's being
Oh, 15, 20 more seconds, so kind of wrap up your final thoughts.
the basic
Okay, we're gonna bring us back together. Thanks. Hopefully you guys had some good, if brief conversations. I'd like to just take a minute or two if we have a couple volunteers to share just a thought from that conversation. Either something you took away from what your elbow partner said, or something that you shared just about kind of the policy challenges and opportunities, or examples rather in your systems that you've observed. So we'd love to just hear about impact efficient evidence being used. All right, in the back.
Yeah, we'll jump in, I guess.
Okay,
'cause we
go
have-
ahead and stand up and talk as loud as you can. I'm not much
My name's Ken Frank.
Okay, great.
And we were talking about how we're not sure that we see a shift in the use of evidence. That a lot of, we still see administrators choose a policy often based on what's happening in local context, and then they go kind of find some evidence to support that policy. And so we're not sure that we've seen really profound, and maybe what they go to try and find is different than what it used to be,
Okay.
but the motivation is still coming from the choice of the policy first, or at least that's what we're thinking about.
Interesting, okay, good. Good, and this is more at the local school district level?
Yes.
You would say? Okay, great, thank you, helpful. One or two other thoughts? We'll go back, we'll go to the front, then we'll come back to you for final word. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Matthew Courtney. I'm from the Kentucky Department of Education. I would say the biggest shift is that we have LEAs who are actually looking at evidence now. We're having some skill building issues where maybe they're looking at the evidence but they don't actually know what it means or how to act on it. But looking for the evidence is the first step, I think. So that's where we're at.
Great. Good, good.
So I'm just going to have to agree with the first person and then a little bit of the second person too.
Tell us who you are.
Richard Bowman, Albuquerque Public Schools, New Mexico. So we really aren't, as a researcher, I'm not really seeing much actual difference in the use of evidence. Our state's plan does require that school improvement plans have what works clearinghouse interventions in them. But one of the big issues with those is that it's very sensitive to how you implement it. And the way that LEAs may be implementing the thing that works in the What Works Clearinghouse is not necessarily how the What Works Clearinghouse got it. But at least they know that they need to go look at it. So
some consensus, right? We'll take one final thought in particular, but helpful to hear that experience as well from New Mexico. Arguably a state, by the way, that I'm pretty familiar with.
Awesome.
And it's put an emphasis on this in a lot of ways, has this like Principals Pursuing Excellence program that's actually been rigorously evaluated and seemed to have tremendous effects. So I think a state that's taking evidence seriously, so it's really good to sort of hear how that's trickling down to and perhaps not fully
trickling.
Trickling,
That's
yes.
right.
Hopefully that'll be a gush of water, whatever, over time. But thank you for sharing that. Go ahead, tell us who you are and let's share your thought.
Hi, my name is Becca Merrill. I'm from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so I'm part of the Early Learning Network. It's a national network for early learning education. And so some of the work that we did was to look at data-driven decision-making for NC Pre-K, which is the preschool program that's state-funded in North Carolina. And so we interviewed principals, superintendents, and district officials about how they use data and how much they use data. And we're specifically looking at the KEA. And we found that that it's really school and leader dependent. So some principals were really intentional, and I wanted my children to go to that school because of how intentional they were in the way that they use data and the way that they collaborated with teachers around data. And others had no idea how data was whether their teachers were using data, and they obviously weren't themselves. And so, it seemed to be like pockets, and these are, by the way, these are all rural counties. We're focusing on the rural context. And so, with the way that the KEA is structured in North Carolina, however, it kind of forces teachers to notice data because they have to then make some sort of assessment on a construct progression about that student, and so it kind of forces them to notice that data, and then it forces them to make some sort of interpretation, but then moving from noticing, interpreting, and then into how does that change your instruction? That's where we're seeing a gap. But I think these are moving forward. And so I would say that, in some schools, data is, even in these rural contexts, data is definitely being noticed. But at the district level, we didn't see as much intentionality about that.
Great, thank you. Really important points about variation and the sort of impact of school leadership, district leadership, in some cases state leadership, how's that influencing behavior change? And we probably see different things play out in different ways, in part because of that, right? So in places where you're not perhaps seeing any shifts whatsoever, I'd be curious to know how much of that has to do with sort of the
local sort of belief in buy-in support for experience using consulting evidence, using evidence historically, and experiences with that. I think that a lot of prior experience, people bring a lot of sort of prior experience and beliefs to the work, and exposure can make a difference. So really helpful. Thanks for indulging and sharing those examples. We want to talk now for the next couple of minutes just about kind of the research landscape as it is. I think we, as a field, we arguably have sort of more evidence, more research evidence and access to that evidence than we have before, although I think there's still significant gaps, some of which we were privileged to hear John King lay out last year. But I'd like to start, KHALILAH, actually hearing from you in particular about sort of thinking about the existing evidence base. What equity concerns do you have, or are there out there in the existing body of evidence for interventions and policies and practices? And the second part of that, I'll just see this now, is how can researchers, policymakers, and practitioners address those gaps? So the first one is just what concerns do you have from an equity standpoint, and then what might we do about that, about some of those concerns?
Yeah. Yep, great question. So first and foremost, if you pull up to a 30,000 foot level, the question of equity seems to evade many people in terms of what they mean by equity. And a lot of the evidence we have, again, to my previous comment about what we believe achievement looks like for different populations, can skew the evidence or supposed evidence that we have right now about what interventions are quality. And also when you think of the word intervention, kind of who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who are we intervening for? So sometimes the research is focused on fixing students or fixing schools, when intervention should be looked at more broadly in terms of both the school level, the LEA level, and the SBA level, right? So right now we don't see states adopting equity policies or taking a hard look at their entire structure and policies, how they function, as relates to equitable practice and equitable opportunity for students. So if equity is only hiring more diverse teachers, or if equity is only access to certain coursework, and there's not a more robust evaluation of where equity exists and inequity exists across operations, across community engagement, then the data really is going to be limited. And as long as the evidence is looking at school alone strategies, instead of looking at how schools directly interact with community, there's going to be flaws in that data because students go in and out of community when they go to school. They don't, and if they're going to a school that may be showing promising results, they still go back into their communities. And so I haven't seen a lot of research or evidence around interventions that takes a holistic look at the community environment and also how local government is working to ensure that communities are healthy so that even when students are benefiting from promising academic programs, they're going back into healthy communities. And absent that, we will continue on a cycle of looking at equity from a vantage point of communities that are being underinvested in versus communities that are not. And the data will always be skewed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I'd also say that a big gap in research is who's doing the research and what research is valued. Are we valuing the voices of the directly impacted communities? Are we poo-pooing qualitative data for the sake of quantitative data? We know, for those of us who have been in the industry for decades, that education reforms were really done to communities instead of with communities. And we can't take for granted that a challenge that is persistently, it's kind of like on a hamster wheel when it comes to taking a look at what interventions work. If we're not using critical theory to take a look at how the communities themselves see the interventions, what interventions they would like to see, and are we then funding those interventions or those strategies for educating their children. We are also going to persistently see a need to shift away from something that might have been promising, but falls flat, and people throw their hands up and say, I don't know what reason that will fall flat. There was a strong evidence base that this should have worked across the state or been able to go to scale, when in fact there were limitations in really engaging community and the directly impacted on how they perceive those strategies, if that makes sense.
It does, you raise a couple of key points. One, just about engagement, in particular, pulling out the comment you made about engagement of impacted communities in not just participating in the research that someone else designs external to the community without input, but really doing it in a collaborative way and having there be a more democratic, you know, there's a movement called sort of democratizing evidence, and I think a big part of that is bringing the impacted communities to the table on the front end to design the research and ask what are the questions, right? That starting with what are the questions that you have, not what is the question that I have as a researcher, and how can I just sort of do this research study, like get your permission to come into your schools and do this study. So I think that's one really important point, the engagement throughout the process, asking the research questions. And then I think you touched on implementation, and I think I think probably everyone in this room recognizes that you know, the most evidence-based thing, and this is oversimplifying things, but you could have the most the thing backed by the strongest, most rigorous, generalizable, valid and reliable evidence, and you don't take into account the set of conditions that made that true in the study. Or in the study conditions, right? And then you go out and do it, you implement, and you didn't attend to those issues of implementation. Not surprisingly, you're not seeing the results. And so I think those are two really good points. Given some of those limitations, KHALILAH, that you mentioned, SENG, I'm curious sort of what, you know, from a practitioner, policymaker standpoint, what like equity and context considerations should we consider as practitioners and policymakers when thinking about a policy decision and thinking about selecting something and consulting the evidence base? Like, how do we both acknowledge some of those limitations and perhaps by acknowledging them, use that to sort of help us figure out, you know, how to make the best possible decision despite the limitations?
So this actually, I think, is building upon what was just shared, which is fantastic. So I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I'm going to talk about too. In the context of state agencies, what I will share is, very briefly, when I entered NDE, there was a leadership push to really transition how we viewed ourselves as a state agency. Most folks historically would have said, I'm a state employee, that's what I am. And I'm like, no, you're an equity leader. You're an equity warrior. Like, you are here to transform education systems. Like, if that's not why you're here, then maybe, like, we can try to find something else that's a better fit for you, quite frankly, right? Because this work is urgent. And so the reason why I'm sharing that is because in the roles that we're in, we really have to think critically and strategically around how we can leverage that to ensure that all students have access to high-quality learning opportunities. So for us in particular, one of the things that our team, Gabby and I, talk a lot about with our teammates is we are all a part of a larger system. And I think starting there and understanding and acknowledging that there are some groups of people that historically have benefited from a system that was designed this way to benefit certain groups of people. And then the system is also in place to not benefit certain groups of people. And the reason why I bring that up is because in acknowledging that, then you can consciously stop yourself when you're making key decisions to then say, wait a second, am I participating in perpetuating the inequities that exist within the education system? And that's what's really, I think, a critical moment. So here's a perfect example. When we think about funding evidence-based interventions, we also have conversations around who are these people who are coming into the state of Nevada or who are in the state of Nevada? And are they culturally competent? And then have they been trained in equity, like issues of equity? And the reason why is because, quite frankly, when you start meeting teams, I'm going to be really candid about this. it is clear as day who is comfortable talking about race, power, privilege, talking about communities of color versus folks who are like, I can't talk about any of those things, but here's the service I'm going to deliver to all these black and brown kids. And I'm like, guess what? It's probably not going to work. And so I think having those honest, courageous conversations. So the first thing that I would encourage state and district leaders to do is really stop partners at the door and ask them, like, what training has your team had on cultural competencies, on issues of equity, on in conversations around inclusion and diversity. Like, if those are some of the values that your state and district are espousing, then you need to live those values every day. And if you are not living those values every day, then quite frankly, your words don't mean they mean nothing to students. I'm going to be very candid about it. It doesn't mean anything. And so that's kind of number one. Make sure researchers, policymakers, and whoever is entering your schools like meet your high standards. The second thing is, and I think KHALILAH, right, just was addressing this too, but be mindful about making sure that you don't use research and data as weapons against communities of color, because historically, they have been. And I'll give you a clear example, because some folks are like, wait, what is she talking about? So, quick story about me. Story is, here I am, low income, first generation middle school graduate, Asian American student. Guess what? Most educators like, Asian American students, really smart, right? So I got great grades, really high, like, was an excellent student, and folks are like, she doesn't need any help. And I was like, wait, no, my parents didn't even graduate from middle school. I have no idea how to navigate the system. And every educator that I literally, from like elementary school through college, would say, you're just fine. So guess what they would do, historically? This has been an issue, it is still an issue. They would say, you know what, you actually don't need that bridging course to help you get from high school to college. Oh wait, you don't need any college counseling, you're fine. So they actually denied opportunities that I needed, even though I was like, but if you look at all the data for my community, for my family, for me, it should be clear as day, because you're a researcher, or you've got a master's degree, or a PhD, you should know better, right? But here I am as a 10-year-old advocating for myself, and still being told, you can't have access to these things. So being really cognizant about how you categorize data, because we decide and have the power to categorize data. We categorize groups of students. We make assumptions about what we think is best for these groups of students based on what we think we know, because the research says that. And so I think being really mindful about, again, not doing things to people, but really engaging in what are their needs, because the key is the nuances of data and research and evidence. It's the nuances, and that's how you're going to be able to get really smart policies. The last thing I would say is fund opportunities for organizations that include leaders of color. And the reason why I'm saying this is one learning lesson that we've had in the state of Nevada for the past 2 years with us funding evidence-based interventions. What has happened, and we have noticed, is that those organizations that are best positioned to win large competitive grant dollars, those organizations have historically been privileged. They are typically led by people in positions of power, and they typically are led by, I'm just gonna name it, white men and white women, right? So it's the local organizations, the local community-based organizations led by communities of color that are like saying, we don't even know researchers, we don't even know who could help us do this work, but we've got these great programs, and we think things are going really well for kids, and they're just not in a position to really, I think, be in a place where they are the most competitive. And so being really thoughtful about how you strategize around supporting really local community leaders, local community organizations, researchers of color. And the reason I'm going to name this again, almost every time I'm in any of these talks, I will look around the room, and there are always only a handful of people of color, leaders of color, within the room. And I think, again, if these are the values that we're espousing, these are opportunities for us to strategically and purposefully say, I need to be intentional about the decisions I make.
Thanks so much. Do you want to build off of that and then maybe talk about how an equity-minded learning or research agenda could perhaps, what that would look like and how it could perhaps pull in some of the ideas that SENG surfaced?
Well, I think, when we think about the existing body of evidence, there are a lot of holes, especially for underserved students. And knowing, I think as KHALILAH, you were talking about, sort of the what works for whom under what conditions question that I think as a field we've been more thoughtful about, but we don't yet have evidence base that considers all of those. And I think, it's thinking about what are the considerations to take evidence that wasn't done in a community like ours, and how do we apply it in a community that has different values, family structures, community values that need to be considered when you're thinking about doing an evidence-based intervention. Is it going to fit within the context and the conditions of our community? And I think I was sharing this with some of my panelists that, the regional educational laboratories, there's 10 of us across the country, we have a group that we look at evidence use in education, and we've been putting together this set of considerations for states and districts and schools to think about this issue, about how do you apply evidence that's been generated in a different community, because there are so many areas where underserved communities do not have evidence about what the effect of certain interventions on our own communities have, right? So thinking about what do you do when you find this other intervention? How do you then try to apply it? What are the questions you need to ask? So I just wanted to mention that there's some thought happening in the research community around this as well, and I'm sure many of you have also been thinking about this. Like, how do you take this this whole and help others build the evidence base within their own communities, like Nevada is doing by funding rigorous evaluation at the local level, and take existing evidence and think about its application in your own community. I think, you were asking about like the equity-focused research and learning agendas, and I think it's with that in mind, if you have an equity lens and you're identifying priorities with that lens, that's a big role for states and districts to first say, what are our priorities as a community, as an agency? I think that's one. I think there's also, we've been talking a lot about data, so I think a really strong agenda has data accessibility is really considered, and mechanisms for using data in a way for that continuous improvement, right? Those processes to really drive decisions. I think another equity-focused research and learning agenda component is that there are good sort of progress and outcome measures. We've been talking about different metrics, and we don't have all the right metrics. And as KHALILAH talked about, there are certain metrics that we just assume are the right ones, but there are also really important progress measures that we need to build in that can better reflect our communities. Also, there should probably, in an equity-focused research agenda, be specific research questions that address the needs of underserved students and communities. I think those are really important, and I wanted to recognize SARA and her team for, a lot of what Results for America does is sort of bring some of that information out to light, and so my assessment here is based on some really good work that Sarah and her team did, thinking about learning agendas that different states have. Massachusetts has a really strong learning agenda. Some other states here, Kentucky has a really strong one as well. So, finding those examples about you're setting priorities, those priorities are influenced by an equity lens, and then you're getting the local communities mechanisms to use those priorities, to use data to think about how those priorities are playing out in their own communities.
And I would just add, the push, going back to what we said before, around who's at the table to establish those learning agendas and ask the questions and set the research focus. So if you're sitting around a table of folks that look like me, and your community doesn't look like me, that's problematic from the get-go. So I think that's one place just from the start that we've got to get much more intentional about. So I want to make sure that we have lots more questions we could ask of the panelists, but we have about 20 minutes left, and I think I would love to just, if it's okay with the panelists at this point, open it up to you all. What questions do you have? What's on your mind? What haven't we covered that you were hoping we would? And let's just hear from you, questions you have for the panelists or just thoughts, contributions in the next 15, 17 minutes or so. Seng's going to be our mic runner.
So this is something I've been thinking about. In our current climate of, I don't know, I feel like we're like this political climate. There's talk about a lot of division, a lot of people that are kind of swinging way left into equity thoughts, and then kind of way right into fearful thoughts of immigration and things like that. And then we have ESSA, which is super equity based, and it's almost like within education, the legislature has said that we should be able to create a utopia of equity without really addressing accountability for our society, the society that's created and you know, like created all the institutional barriers and all the places of disadvantage for minoritized peoples, you know, like, and so I think I find it really interesting that ESSA came out of that same body of people who then support other policies that are so different and really turn the needle the other direction. So I would like to hear, I think all of you have really interesting perspectives, and I'd really love to hear how you see like that battle coming out. Like, how can we battle inequity only in education? How can, without really addressing something outside of education, these cycles that are going to keep expecting teachers and principals to make up for all the ways that other things, all the trash and all the mess and all the inequities that society creates. Kind of a downer. Sorry to start on that.
You started with a softball.
How will you
Kalila, were you able to hear that? Could you hear that?
I was. I would love to jump in on that question.
Please do. Go for it.
So, let me say this. Some of the work that you're going to see coming out of CAP as we refresh our strategy and approach in light of the coming presidential election is to name a thing. And I think that the education community can really be pace setters when it comes to that. So you hear words like diversity, equity, inclusion, and oftentimes they're code words for like, are you talking about the Black kids, or are you talking about the indigenous kids on this reservation? Like, who are you talking about, and what are you attempting to accomplish? The other thing is there are many well-meaning people who want to address gaps in achievement, but have not yet reconciled the gaps in opportunity, right? And so they hold this belief around work and equity not being about all children, right? And so what I teach my students in my course is that equity and culturally relevant practice is for everyone. And I think as policy, as researchers, and those of us who are policymakers or proposing policy, we need to make the case for elected officials or appointed officials at whatever level they may be, whether it's at the schoolhouse level, again, the LEA or SEA level, and also in federal government, that there's an economic case and a national security case for ensuring that students have equitable opportunity. And people conflate equality and equity. And I think what we all want to see is that there is an equal commitment to all students, but an equitable investment in students, right? We see the recent study from EdBuild around the $23 billion more being spent on non-white school districts, even though most students in public schools, well, I think I said that backwards. $23 billion more being spent on the white school districts above non-white school districts, even though public schools reflect mostly non-white students. They're in the majority now. EdTrust has this great study around funding gaps, and at CAP we did a study on outcomes of funding litigation. And I think that's an opportunity for us to really break through on the political front and use ESSA to close gaps and also have critical conversations about how our schools are funded, frankly. We keep seeing this issue of local control over dollars used to both segregate opportunity, segregate families, segregate resources, and we really need to address that. So, you know, I think that question is right on point. There's a nexus between policy and politics, of course, but we need to be making the case around how the equity benefits this country, and also why it's important that equity is centered in educational practice and research and not in addition, because it benefits all of our kids. But we're gonna have to do the work to make sure we're making the case on how it does benefit all children, particularly for those people who, again, are well-meaning, but haven't done the personal work around naming inequity, particularly by race and income, such that we're developing policies that in turn address them.
Great. We'll go to the back and we'll come back up front to you.
Hi, I'm Katie Kryakovich from United Federation of Teachers in New York City. And I'd like to follow up on your point to the personal work that needs to be done. Ultimately, if we are going to achieve a more equitable system, a lot of that has to translate into the work that's done in every classroom, in every school, in every classroom. And what we're seeing, at least in New York, is a lot of work being done on the policy level, but then what happens is policy and program being imposed on the school level without doing the work to make sure that everyone is understanding why the work is being done. And it's much more successful if everyone understands the why. Do you have examples of systems that you have worked with or know of where they have done this work, and how have they laid the good groundwork so that we can have the success that is needed?
Was that question for me?
Anyone, feel free to jump in and say, I'm wondering if there are any examples locally of that happening after KHALILAH responds.
Yeah, so I'll give you a great example. I live in Baltimore City, and this gets to my point about research and policy making being done with as opposed to done to communities. There was a grassroots effort to approach the school district to establish a working group on recruiting and retaining Black teachers explicitly. The school district is 80% Black. The school district welcomed that effort. It was an effort that came from the grassroots. There are teachers, community members, faith community, and the district all working on this effort together. And so there's no opportunity for it to come from a top-down level. When we know through the data that Baltimore City schools lost a large quantity of Black teachers in about a 10 or 12-year window. So we have the data. We had the community saying that's not acceptable for our kids. And we had a district that was open to receiving that critique as opposed to putting up a wall and saying, we know what's best about education. We're the experts. We'll take it under consideration, or maybe we'll have a closed door strategy working on this. And instead they are working, they both have, sessions with just the group who surfaced this. There was a public call. The school district emailed every single family and said that anyone who wanted to participate on this working group could, which is not normal for this school district. They usually go to the power players and say, hey, we have an idea, we want to work on this, will you join this working group? And then the other thing that happened the other thing happening is outside of the working group meeting together, they have public forums every quarter to update the community about what's happening and to get more feedback on strategies that are being recommended. So I think that's a great example for other districts to consider what walls and barriers they put up for the community surfacing strategies for issues that they see in their schools.
Great example. LENAY is going to jump in, I think, and then saying if you have another thought. Go for it.
I just wanted to share there's a school district in Arizona that is on the sort of outside, right on the edge of a large urban area within southern Arizona, majority English learner students, has had tons of turnover in the superintendent over the last decade plus. The community thought about what do we need to address these equity issues that are happening with our English learners specifically. The superintendent is now from the community. He was a student in the district, went on to get a doctorate, came back to the community and said, I'm going to address these issues. And what they did is they developed this what they call a coherence framework, which has equity, it has evidence and continuous improvement, and student agency. And it brings it all together. And what they use as a mechanism to get to the school level is that teachers are leading the work. It's not the district coming in and saying, we're doing this. It's the teachers leading the work to say, what does it take to to help students develop agency? How do we use evidence and an equity lens to do that? So it's been really remarkable to see that. I mean, we don't have outcomes yet from what they're working on. They're still working on it, right? And it takes time for some of that. We don't always have the measures and the metrics to show progress, but the conversations have shifted and it's owned at the school level, which I think is really powerful.
Thanks. Any final thought on that? I want to one or two more questions.
A quick thought. So we don't have examples of success stories, but I think this is an opportunity, and I will encourage state and district leaders to think about this in terms of policy. One of the things that we've thought about doing is then prioritizing funding, for example, for teacher leaders. Right? Like, we have the discretion as a state agency to say, we're going to take this chunk of federal or state dollars, and now we're going to make it even more restrictive and say, we're going to prioritize teacher leadership development. So, for example, that could look like, and this is what we're thinking about for one of our Native American strategies across the state of Nevada, is saying we want to increase the number of national board certified teachers within schools that predominantly serve Native American students. And even better, if these teachers are Native American teachers on the reservation, for example. So I think being really intentional and thoughtful about making sure that it isn't just held at this central office, within districts that will be responsive to this, but really bringing it to the school level and thinking about how we redirect strategies so that it is actually benefiting and supporting teachers, like in terms of their equity development, cultural competency, and then of course, like making sure that they're using evidence too. So we are in the process of trying to figure that out right now.
Great. Thanks for those examples. It feels like a ripe topic to try and gather those. It's like I'm thinking of, for my next little sort of surveying of the landscape, it would be really interesting to try and compile some of those grassroots efforts that are really trying to bring evidence and equity together. There was another question right up here. If you're still, yes, thanks. We'll hear from you. Thanks.
My name is Aubrey Compertor. I'm from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So my question, I guess, is directed to those who are helping districts implement these programs or supporting them financially or what have you, and wondering to what extent you or the districts are looking at implementation integrity rather than simply the outcomes, right? Like, especially talking about these evidence-based interventions, and they look great on paper in these RCTs and these quasi-experiments, but then they are like, what just happened in my school? So I'm wondering to what extent you kind of give some leeway to that and give some time for proper implementation and really getting to look at what the enabling conditions are that are helping that, and to what extent that might kind of help around equity and things like that. Thank you.
Such a great question. I was wondering, Kendra might be doing something else if she was listening, because I think the work Massachusetts has done. Did you hear some of that question, like, really speaks? I think Massachusetts has invested, not to put you on the spot, has invested, right, has been really thoughtful about not just sort of what are the long-term outcomes that we expect to see, in particular from the investments we're making in our, persistently underperforming schools, historically struggling schools and communities. So not just like sort of what are the long-term lagging indicators, what are the academic achievement indicators that we ultimately are trying to impact, but what would we expect to see in a turnaround effort or in a school improvement effort at the 30-day mark, at 60 days, at 90 days, et cetera. So Kendra, you might be able to speak, you will of course be able to speak better than this to me, but I think what you're describing is exactly what Massachusetts has been doing actually for quite some time now. So I wonder, Kendra, if there's anything that any color you would add to that.
Yeah, so I would, give a big nod to my colleagues in our turnaround office, which now has a different name, but I just can't remember what it is. If you go to the Massachusetts Department of Education, the site, and just put in the search term turnaround, you'll find there's an entire series of resources that have been built by that team that include research that they conducted over the period of about 5 or 6 years, which was qualitative, looking at those districts that were successful in their turnaround effort, and what were the kinds of things that they did. And we're very thoughtful about creating field guides, which were not just research guides. So we could give people, so for example, like the latest one really talks about like the first 100 days, for a turnaround effort from a principal's perspective. There are case studies on, what different principals did and different staff members did related to specific turnaround practices. We also have done some quantitative research, but to, one of the points that I think KHALILAH made, it is interesting about IES and ESSA how much they are favoring quantitative work when, for example, one of the things I've been trying to do for a long time, and this relates to our turnaround findings, our turnaround results were very good quantitatively, but they in fact were that much more effective for students who were English language learners and students with disabilities. But to really do a good study of what's happening with ELLs, who are, I would argue, are probably among our most underserved populations in the state, we really, frankly, we really need funds for qualitative research. It's not all about quantitative numbers, and Massachusetts is very good at collecting data and reporting out way too much data in ways that nobody can read. But the turnaround stuff, I think, is really an exception to that, and hopefully it's very helpful to people who are, in the field working in districts and schools directly.
I also think this is to sort of connect the dots with some of what we've talked about already, opportunities to bring impacted communities into the fold and into the process. To me, and I don't know where this is happening really effectively, or if it is, to be quite honest. But I would love to see, right now I think there's still this very sort of accountability-based dynamic when we think about what it looks like to monitor, whether it's in the school improvement space or any sort of oversight role in monitoring work that's being done that's sort of a, state monitoring a district monitoring schools, et cetera. And I would love to see that sort of turned on its head and think about what it would mean to sort of at the front end as you're beginning to implement, you've selected a new program or some sort of approach, and at the beginning, at the outset, you're baking in sort of this, you're bringing the right people to the table, a more diverse set of folks to the table, and at the outset, you're saying, well, what would we want to see? What are we trying to do? What are our hopes and dreams for this program? What would we expect to see? Let's identify some of those things together, and then let's sort of have this joint, Sang talked about this before, this sort of joint and shared investment and accountability for the results, and let's turn these monitoring implementation into sort of these really opportunities to gain insight and understand what is effective, what's not, and if not, why not? And that's often what's missing from evaluation in general, is that we get results, and whether or not they're positive or negative, we don't often know. We don't know why, and that's actually where the learning can imagine.
Can I just add, so the other thing that we do, which Sarah just touched on, is we do all of our monitoring, is we have a third-party external organization that conducts our monitoring, and there's information about, we do monitoring site visits at every school that engages in competitive turnaround funding. So not every school, especially now that with ESSA, that writes a turnaround plan. And it's very much like what Sarah has just described. And so the report is written for the school, it's not written for us. There's a sit-down meeting with the school. Again, we're not the ones doing the monitoring, and we specifically created that situation to really sort of, there's not really a Chinese wall, because obviously we can read the same reports, but it's not us. It's because the hope is that it will contribute to the continuous improvement of that school or that district, as opposed to really just being a compliance exercise.
And I know we have just a minute left, but I wanted to just bring that back to, so thank you, Kendra, for that rerouting in this cycle of continuous improvement. If we think about it, it's inform, select, plan, implement, analyze. And that plan piece is where you can say, what are the implementation considerations? What will this really take to work? And think about that ahead of time. And WestEd, we put out an evidence guide in 2017, and we have a set of 6 tools, and tools 5 and 6 do exactly, Sarah, what you were talking about, which is what are we trying to do, and then what supports and strategies are going to get us to that result, and what are the context considerations and implementation considerations to see if it will work in our communities. So I think that's just something, if we think about it as a cycle of continuous improvement, that plan piece is important.
So we have just under a minute left, and I know everyone, it's the end of the day. It's been a long day for everyone. Everyone hopefully is going to the reception. We'll get to spend time with your colleagues. But I want to just do one quick last rapid fire round from our panelists before we thank them and close out. And so I think it actually ties back to the beginning, your comment at the beginning, sir, and I'm forgetting your name. Tell me one more time.
Ken Frank.
Ken, okay, great. The Ken Frank is kind of well, I don't know that anything's really that different, right? I'm not sure we're seeing a lot of changed behavior. And I think there are a lot of skeptics out there, in particular when we talk about ESSA, who are kind of well, great, for years states and districts have had these opportunities and they haven't taken advantage of them. Why should we believe that now suddenly that ESSA has passed and there are evidence provisions in place and we're doubling down on this idea of equity, even though it's ill-defined and we talk about it euphemistically way more than we should. Why should we expect things to look different now and moving forward? And so we're ending on, just trying to end on more of an optimistic or high point rather than this sort of oh man, nothing's changed and let's just continue on and go back to our desks and keep working. I'd love to just hear from each of you, 30 seconds. Why should we? Why are you optimistic? Why should we feel optimistic right now about the future of evidence-based policy making and in pursuit of equitable opportunities and outcomes for kids?
I'll start. This is Seng. Very briefly, all I will say is that the kids across the state, our state, and across the United States deserve much better than what we've given them. And knowing that, that is what keeps me optimistic, keeps our team very hopeful, and keeping that alive and encouraging other educators to believe in that too, because really it's that belief that yes, if we collaborate together, if we learn together and grow together and continuously improve together, we can transform lives. And so just keeping that in the back of my mind and my pocket is what I use. And the word that I would, just had a conversation with some folks about this too, education is not just a public good. It is a public good with a moral imperative. And it is up to us to remind people that that's what it is.
Thank you. LENAY, and then we'll end with KHALILAH.
Yeah, I'm optimistic because of states like Nevada and lots of states across the country that are using this as an opportunity to say, what is working, what isn't working, and what can we change? This is the opportunity of ESSA. This is the opportunity of evidence and the intersection with equity is saying, we're not just gonna do what we've always done. We're gonna say, does it work? Is it not working? And provide the mechanism to do something different. So that's why I am.
Great. Bring us home, KHALILAH. Why are you optimistic?
I'm optimistic because conversations like this are even happening, right? 10 years ago, it was not on the table to be discussing equity at all. And, I would challenge everybody to use their voices, right? Oftentimes we think that policies are for someone else to make and for us to implement. But, I want to co-sign what Seng said about young people. They always get it right, and they've been showing us evidence of what it takes to really be aggressive about creating community environment and policies that will support future generations. So that always fills me up. But I think conversations like this continuing to happen and resources being developed to support people, both in quality implementation, thoughtful research, and continuing to advocate with elected officials and appointed officials for the policies that we want to see. I will also say the last thing we should do in every environment is ask who is not at the table, right? And If you can do that, then you will have a more productive outcome, whatever you may be doing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, KHALILAH, for joining us remotely. Sorry for
I wish I was there.
We wish you were here too. We're going for some good barbecue after this.
Murphy's Law, Murphy's Law.
We'll do it again sometime. So join me in thanking our panelists and thank all of you.